Kia ora everybody and welcome back to Humankind. So, the closed beta has just wrapped, and it could be the last opportunity that the average player has to experience Humankind before it releases in August. That's only really a few weeks away at this point. We may see an open beta, but I imagine if we do, it'll be very similar to the closed beta that's just finished. Anyway, in this video I wanted to reflect a little bit on the beta experience, on some of the things that I noticed, some of my newly shaped impressions, and some things that have changed since previous iterations like the Victor Open Dev. This is going to be more of a free-flowing commentary than a more technical, harsh review, but if you're interested in that, I'm actually working on a much larger form project where I go through the benefits and then the drawbacks, right? The good and the bad, the plus and the minuses of Humankind. So keep an eye out for that, and I'll link it down below in the doodly-doo once it's done. Anyway, so the Humankind Beta wrapped up, okay, and I have some thoughts on it, both on gameplay and also on performance and value. And so I'll cover off sort of those three things in this video, mainly catered towards some of the questions that you guys have been asking. First up, I actually posted a poll on the channel page about what do you guys think of the beta? I asked a few questions, or what do you think of it? What's some of the strengths and weaknesses to help me inform my future video? But also, I wanted to know if you guys thought it had changed much. If you thought it had gotten better or worse, or really indifferent towards it. And by and large, majority of you thought the same as me. This beta experience is very similar to what we've seen before, except of course this time we had access to some of the later cultures in the game. So it was more of a fleshed out experience. We could play the first 200 turns and experience 5 out of 7 of the game's eras. So there's definitely some more late game that we haven't quite experienced yet. So as I'm giving these reflections, I'm reflecting on the early, mid, and then sort of as we inch our way into the late game, but I can't fully reflect on the late game as a whole. One thing that I really noticed was pacing. Pacing of Humankind. So, as I've said, we only had 200 turns, max. But something that I found, and I wonder if you guys found the same as playing through it, I noticed that the early game was fun. Of course, we were limited to one map, so in terms of exploration, it was, you know, there weren't a lot of surprises, potentially, after you'd played through it once or twice. But I did still really enjoy the early game discovery parts of Humankind. And I found the early game to be particularly interesting. Both the early and the mid game, actually. However, I noticed that the late game, and we didn't actually even have full experience of the late game, so citation needed, but the sort of mid to late game for me felt like it dragged. There's no real way to glorify that. It felt like a drag from around, I want to say, turn 100 to turn 120 through until the end of the game. Reason being, I was either at that point so far ahead in terms of fame, and my game plan was so well established that it didn't really matter. I was just sort of going through the paces, picking up the wonders, and winning the game with fame, obviously, as the final score. Or, if I was playing on a really hard difficulty, at that point I felt sort of a bit demoralized. Not necessarily because I'd been absolutely crushed by the AI, but I don't know, rather it felt like a grind. So around that sort of 120 turn point, I felt like either the game had turned into a bit of a grind and I wasn't really doing much more because of the difficulty and because I was just sort of in my place and this was my place in the game. I was probably still going to win, to be fair, but, you know, this was my place and I had to go through the motions. Or, similarly, I was so far ahead that it was a foregone conclusion, which is a shame. And I wonder if the addition of those later eras, of Era 6 and 7, will help to flesh that out. Some ideas that I've had as I've been reflecting on the beta and on my experience was, I think that definitely the addition of more maps, of larger maps, of more AI players would be really helpful to fix that. And also I'm quite hopeful, anyway, that those later eras will introduce preferably some more unique military units and some kind of global diplomacy. I think that those later eras could really take advantage of some global diplomacy in a similar way that Civ 6 does, but more fleshed out. I'm thinking large events, I'm thinking calls for aid, emergency war declarations, think real world UN Security Council, and then pretend like the real world UN Security Council doesn't have its hands tied all of the time, and that's the kind of system I'd like to see in Humankind in those later eras, because I think that would really spice things up. It would also build on the narrative story that Humankind tells, right? Which, by the way, is one thing that I love. The narrative events, the random events that are tied to both things that you've discovered or things that you haven't discovered. You know, those like, do you want to let these people in at the cost of 100 gold and unintended consequences? Those sorts of events, I think, really, really dynamic and shouldn't be overlooked in the game. And I think that in those later eras, Humankind, Amplitude Studios, and the developers could really capitalize on those events at a much larger scale and across nations, across civilizations, across cultures, and indeed across really the whole game. So I think that that's one way that they could fix the later game drag. In terms of fixing the earlier game drag, that is more complicated. How do you make the mid-game more exciting? And some of you watching this might think, well, actually, I found the mid-game perfectly fine. And if that's you, do let me know, because I want to know your perspective in the same way that you're watching this, and if you're still listening, you're well above average viewer, by the way, who tends to clock out around the 4.5 minute mark. So congrats to you, pat on the back. We should all give ourselves a pat on the back for making it this far into my ramblings. But I digress. In seriousness, I think that fixing the mid-game drag is, for me anyway, a little bit more problematic for the studio, and I'll be really interested to see how they fix that. But I think that they could pull those ideas that I've just shared around more events, more inclusiveness with the wider community in the game. They could pull those into the mid-game just as easily. My thinking is basically you could strengthen the storytelling by strengthening diplomacy. Whether it's good diplomacy, like the diplomatic victory sort of stance, or bad diplomacy, right? The war stick is a form of diplomacy, and let's not forget that. Diplomacy doesn't just have to be boring, okay? Diplomacy can be fun. In fact, I think diplomacy is fun. But that's just me. Maybe. Let me know. Now, toward the end of the video now, I'll share a little bit more about my Humankind projects moving forward, if you're interested in those. But also, I want to touch on performance and value of the game, just quickly, because it was a closed beta, so to get access, you either had to watch your favorite streamers on Twitch, rip YouTube, sad for me, or you had to pre-order it. So in terms of value, there was a high cost to entry in terms of either time or dollars. Do I think it was worth it? Actually, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Heck yes. It was a really fun beta experience. I loved playing it on the channel and live streaming with you guys, and I hope that you guys enjoyed it too. In terms of performance, I noticed it was better than the previous versions. My game didn't crash once this time, and any regular viewers will know that during the Victor Open Dev, I had big issues with game crashing, and my system isn't that unique either. I run very sort of mid-range specs, low to mid-range, if I'm honest. Mid-range is an overstatement. I run a very average, I have like a GTX 1660 or something. It's nothing exuberant, but it's nothing exuberant. However, I was able to run Humankind much better this time than last time. It didn't crash. General performance was better, which I think is hopeful and a really good sign for the full release. And that gives me a lot of confidence in recommending the full release to people. Because if the beta was working better for me, then the full release should be even better still, in theory. Understanding there'll be a lot more, hopefully, in the game, but still. I do think that performance was pretty good. The only thing that I noticed was wonders made the game really lag a lot, and going into the, like, after I'd selected my culture or playing those films or trying to choose a wonder, a cultural wonder to build, that was the only area where I noticed the game not performing particularly well, and I think that's something to consider moving forward. If this is lagging the game at that point, what's it going to be like in later eras where there are potentially a lot more units at play? Something to think about, but overall I was really happy with both the value and the performance. That brings us to the end of this video. Thank you so much for joining me on my reflections on the Humankind Beta. Overall, a great experience, and I am actually really genuinely excited for the full release of the game. which releases at the moment, planned for 17th of August 2021. I do have some full reflections and more sort of reviews and critiques and analysis of Humankind coming this week, so do keep an eye out for those. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.